Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can very quickly and effectively paint the new Skaven Clanrats. I've got to say, as someone who started in 6th edition fantasy, these guys have come a long way. The new models are so fierce and dynamic and detailed and just look incredible for just basic ravening horde cannon fodder models. Now, that can be a little daunting when you're looking at 20 tiny, very detailed models, but I'm going to show you it's actually a very easy process painting these guys, and we're going to be using almost exclusively contrast paints. I'm going to be showing you specifically the rat on the left, and he has no additional highlights to him, nothing fancy. This is literally just put a layer of contrast paint over this surface and that's it. So that being said, let's get started. First, I prime my miniature using gray Seer spray. Now, it's really similar to what Korax white used to be. It's basically an eggshell, so an incredibly light gray. The reason I went with a light gray is because it gives slightly more muted tones to any paints that are put over top of that, especially transparent ones like contrast paint. So if you wanted punchier, brighter, more vibrant colors, go with a white or possibly an ivory if you're working with reds and yellows. Ivory will make those colors warmer, but if you want something a bit more muted, stick with a light gray. Next, I always start with the largest black surfaces first, mainly because I don't want to get black on any lighter colors later, as it's harder to correct. In this case, this is just black Templar straight from the pot. Now, you may have heard that contrast paints applied straight from the pot run the risk of pooling and blotching and causing coffee stains. Now, that is true in most cases. When not applied over textured surfaces, so when applied over something more smooth, that is absolutely the case because the paint just kind of pools here and there depending on the amount of paint you're applying. But since this is a mostly textured surface, you really don't need to worry about too many splotches. Also, they're Clanrats. Having splotches on their fabric is just part of their daily existence. Now, if you are worried that you're going to have weird blotches on your fabric, feel free to mix in just the tiniest bit of contrast medium. It's going to make your paint a little more transparent, so it'll be a lighter kind of charcoal color instead of the greenish black that you see here. So keep in mind, it will make your paints thinner, but it will also give you a much smoother application. But in all honesty, I found it totally fine to just work with it straight from the pot. Just don't load up your brush so much and you won't have an excess of paint pooling and causing splotches on your miniature. One final note while I finish applying this, if you want to be able to more easily access the kind of inner parts of the miniature, like the cloth and chainmail that hangs down between his legs, I highly recommend taking the miniature off its base. Do not glue these in to the little hole in the base. It makes it way harder to get in there, and you can actually still see in there fairly well, but it's much harder to get your brush in there when he's already on his base. Okay, I literally broke my own rule. As I just said, I normally paint the dark or black surfaces first so they don't get on my light surfaces. However, I was very excited to see the green fabric against the black fabric, so I painted the green fabric next. And all I did to do this was mix 2 drops of Mantis Warrior Green with 1 drop of Black Templar and apply it over the fabric. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what if you get something on this surface later? You just applied a transparent color over white, so how would you fix that if you got a splotch of black on there when I go to do the skin? That's a very good question, but all you need to make this paint into a more opaque paint is just mix it with a regular paint. So you can do that either by mixing it with something of the same color and basically just turning it into a heavier bodied opaque paint to then use as your correction color. You can even mix it with a neutral tone like a kind of light gray or ivory. That'll desaturate it just a tiny bit, but it'll give it enough opacity to cover up any errors. And then you can go back in with the same mixture that you just did, the same glaze that made this primary green color, and just kind of lightly blot it over top of the patch to blend it back in. So if you make a mistake, don't freak out. You can mix contrast paints with regular paints to create a more opaque color that you can then use to cover your mistake. With the green fabric completely dry, you can now move on to the fur, which I should have done first as it is dark. That being said, all it is Black Legion and Lahmian Medium mixed in an even ratio. The reason I chose Lahmian Medium rather than contrast medium is that Lahmian Medium makes paints a little bit more transparent than contrast medium. It also makes them more fluid. I honestly find that I get a smoother application of the paint using Lahmian Medium than Contrast Medium. The only thing you need to be careful of is applying too much, as since it is more fluid now, it is more likely to run into recesses and saturate there. Now, Black Legion is a very warm brown black. You will see this when you mix the Lahmian Medium in. It will make it way more transparent, and you'll actually see those brown tones really show through. Now, I really love this. It's similar to Basilicanum Gray, but I find it to be a little more saturated, have a little bit more brown, and just have just an overall grungier fur looking feel to it. Basilicanum Gray, I feel, looks a little bit more like stone. So either one of those would work great for rat fur. I'm also going with mostly gray tones for my fur because most of my metallics are going to be bronze, which is essentially just a metallic brown or a metallic tan. So if I've got rats with brown fur, I don't want that to blend too much into my metallics. So just kind of be aware of what colors you choose and where they are next to each other on the miniature. Now, one tip, if you notice you've gotten paint anywhere where it's not supposed to be, you just go back in with Gray Seer and tidy it back up, revert it back to the surface that it was when you originally primed it. So Gray Seer is a good one, and ProAcryl Bright Neutral Gray is incredibly opaque. So I highly recommend that as well for a touch-up color. Next, we're going to be painting the tail using my go-to recipe for any kind of inflamed skin or internal organs or any kind of gross organic surface, really. All it is 2 drops of Skeleton Horde Contrast mixed with 1 drop of Volpus Pink. You don't need to thin this down. Skeleton Horde is already very transparent, and then just apply that over the tail. And we're also going to be using this shade of pink on his cute little rodent nose here. Next, we're going to paint the skin portions using an almost identical mixture, except in this case, we use a little bit more Skeleton Horde. So 3 to 4 drops of Skeleton Horde, depending on how pink or how orange you would like the skin to look, and 1 drop of Volpus Pink. If you would like more of an orange tone to your skin, use more Skeleton Horde in your mixture. If you would like more of a pink tone in your skin, use less Skeleton Horde. The Skeleton Horde is essentially just a tan. Tan has yellow in it. Volpus Pink is a pink that has red in it. Yellow plus red equals orange. You end up with an orange flesh tone. You can always use Fireslayer Flesh as well if you would just like to use a contrast paint straight from the pot and not have to worry about mixing anything. Next, for his gross little rodent teeth, we're going to paint his entire mouth in Skeleton Horde. This is a fairly liberal coat, as again, this paint is very transparent, so it takes a little bit extra to build up heavy saturation. You can always thin down Garaghak's Sewer. That's another similar paint, but is much more pigmented, so you are going to have some really filthy, gross brown teeth. Like, you've ever seen, like, beaver's teeth that are, like, alarmingly brownish yellow? Garaghak Sewer is the way to go, but this is just Skeleton Horde contrast because I didn't want them quite so saturated. Next, to paint his gross little rat claws, we're going to be applying a mixture of, once again, Skeleton Horde mixed with Ratling Grime in about a 2-to-1 ratio. If you didn't go for the Garaghak Sewer option on the teeth, you can always add this to the very recesses of the teeth, like I'm doing here, just to give them a little bit more grunge. And speaking of Garaghak Sewer, this is it right here, straight from the pot. I'm using this to paint his little rope belt here. You can use these to paint straps, whatever you like. It's a nice kind of dark tan leather color. That being said, it's also great for painting bronze and dark brass as well, as you will see very shortly. And speaking of metallics, let's start painting some. When I first paint my metallics, I always start with a black base coat. In this case, I'm going to be using Huge Miniatures Anti-Matter Black, and this is their airbrush version, but I will be applying it with just a regular paintbrush. This is by far my favorite black paint on the market, and full disclosure, they're a sponsor of mine, but I use this almost every time I paint. It is so smooth, yet thin and incredibly opaque. So just watch this go on. It is like butter. If you've ever worked with a black ink, it's like that, but minus the residue from inks. The reason I put this down first before I do my metals is just to give a shadow, a line of separation between the metal surface and whatever that surface is sitting on. So that plating there that I'm now painting, that's sitting on top of wood. This black will give a deep shadow to the underside of that where it touches the wood. A black surface is also going to provide a difference in contrast when it comes to stippling on the sword. I'm going to be doing that with a metallic paint. This will give it much more texture having that black underlayer. This is going to make more sense when you see it, but for now, just paint your metallic surfaces black. And before I forget, while I'm waiting for the black to dry, let's go ahead and get his tongue here. This is just Volpus Pink. That's it, straight from the pot. You could probably thin it a little bit just so it's not quite so saturated, but I honestly think that straight from the pot looks just fine. Okay, this is where things start to go off the rails a little bit. This is where it started getting late. I was tired, things get a little disjointed, as you can probably tell that they are starting to. So I went in with zero game plan for the shield. I was just making things up as I went along and hit kind of a creative brick wall when it came to the shield. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go with brown, even though I was going to be doing a bronze on the frame plating there. I really had no game plan. So that kind of came back to bite me. It's not that this process is difficult in actually painting this, but deciding what I wanted to do was basically a problem. So what you see here is just Apothecary White and Skeleton Horde mixed in an even ratio gives you a nice birch color, but I didn't like how that looked with the green, so I changed it. I went back and forth about 20,000 times, and finally just decided, you know what, forget it, we're just gonna do 2 layers of Ratling Grime so it's a dull gray-brown. And then we're just gonna call it good, or call it wood in this case. Next, I went ahead and just added the little Skaven emblem here on the shield. I kind of did this half-heartedly. In all honesty, I could have done this better. If you want your symbols to look a little bit more rugged on weathered wood, don't use quite as much paint. You kind of want the paint just to catch on the edges instead of what you're seeing here where it covers both the edges and the recesses. I'm going to be adding a glaze to this in a sec, so that'll sink into the recesses and create a little bit more shadow there. But if you want more weathered wood, it's best to generally almost treat it as if it was a dry brush and just lightly skim the very tips of the wood. Next, to add a thin layer of grime just to dull down this light emblem a little bit more, I first apply a layer of Lahmian Medium over top. This will cause the subsequent layer of contrast paints to diffuse upon contact. Next, I apply a mixture of 2 drops Skeleton Horde and 1 drop of Ratling Grime. I generally just apply this in a little blot and then rinse my brush and lightly push it around until I'm satisfied. Off screen, I added a glaze using the exact same green in the cowl. It was just an afterthought that I didn't record, but that's where that green tinge came from. Next, we're going to paint our metallics. I generally start by painting my metallic surfaces using a silver, as it is basically just the metallic version of a light gray. In this case, I'm using Ironbreaker. I also highly recommend Vallejo's Game Air Silver. It is just super smooth and has a much finer flake to it, so it's not quite as glittery, but either one will get you a nice light silver. You could use silvers such as Stormhost Silver or Runefang Steel, but I'm not a fan of either one of those paints because they are very transparent and it takes forever to get a good opaque silver like what you see here. So for that reason, I highly recommend Ironbreaker instead. Next, we're going to stipple the surface of the sword while we're already working with Ironbreaker. In this case, I'm using an ELF concealer brush. They're very small, but more importantly, they are rounded tipped. This gives you a nice stippling pattern, which will result in a somewhat speckled textured surface. All you're going to do is treat it like dry brushing, but instead of flicking the brush back and forth or in circular motions, you're going to just lightly jab the surface. I'll generally focus this on the tip of the blade as well as the edges. And basically, you're just looking to build this up in layers, so some of that black still shows through underneath. That is going to be the grungiest portions of our sword once we apply our glazes later. We're nearly done with our metallic base coats. All we have left to do is just apply Liberator Gold to the chainmail, and this is actually going to be a more muted brass color. I plan on doing a video in the future discussing the differences between speed painting metals. For me, brass has more of a pale yellow tone to it, whereas bronze has more tans and browns. So in this case, I'm using Liberator Gold as my base coat because it has a nice pale yellow to this gold already. Once the Liberator Gold has completely dried, you're now ready to finish it off using just a single layer of Ratling Grime straight from the pot. And as for the metal on the shield, this is a deep bronze made from Garaghak sewer mixed with Black Legion in about a 2-to-1 ratio, and make sure to add a drop of Lahmian Medium just so it's a little more transparent, as Black Legion is very saturated. So really not much to this, just swipe it over top and let it dry. Now we're going to go in and just grunge up the sword a little. You can really do this any way you like by mixing different browns into Black Legion, which again also has brown in it, but I used 2 drops of Ratling Grime with 1 drop of Black Legion and made sure to put in just a little tiny bit of Lahmian Medium, as Ratling Grime's fairly transparent, so that way it didn't oversaturate one area. The weird orange hue you're seeing to that now is literally just from my lighting, but yeah, just swipe it over the surface. You can rinse your brush and then wipe away any areas that are too saturated, but that'll give you a nice grungy metal. Now this step is totally optional. All it's meant to do is add a little bit more color saturation to what is currently a more monochromatic surface. All you're going to do is apply some Lahmian Medium over the blade. This is again to make the subsequent layer of contrast paints diffuse. And then all I do next is apply Sigmar brown with a sponge. You can also use Wildwood brown. Any brown transparent paint works great for this. And then immediately after I apply that, I just take a damp brush and push around the brown paint until I'm happy with how it looks. Alright, we're at the very last part. We just have to paint his eyes. Now all you're going to do, take a white paint, any white works, the brighter the better, and then lightly apply it to his eyeball. Once the white has completely dried, just take some Nazdreg Yellow straight from the pot and apply it over that white surface. This will give your Skaven some appropriately sinister yellow eyes. So that is how you paint a Clanrat using mostly just contrast paints. Now I understand this list might look like a lot of paints, but when you compare it to the traditional base paint, shade paint, layer technique, this takes substantially less time and frankly less paints. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you really enjoyed it and want to support the channel, feel free to go shopping at any of the affiliate links listed in the video description. Speaking of which, I also have a couple of related tutorials in the video description as well. One of them shows how I painted the vibrant green Skaven banner that you saw at the beginning of this video, as well as its filthy fabric counterpart. The second video is how you can easily create some muddy swamp bases for your Skaven that would look pretty appropriate with them. And finally, the third video is on a very simple but effective poison weapon effect. So that being said, thanks once again for joining me today, and until we meet again, happy painting everyone.